This is the IBJ Podcast for the week of Monday, January 20th, 2025, brought to you by Taft. I'm your host, Mason King. Welcome back to the podcast, everybody. The official release date of this episode of the podcast is indeed January the 20th, which, not coincidentally, is Inauguration Day. President Trump will outline his vision for a second term, but we already have a sense of what to expect in terms of economic policy. Four of the biggest themes are prioritizing tax cuts, decreasing regulation in several major industries, increasing tariffs on imported goods from trading partners like Mexico, Canada, and China, and cracking down on illegal immigration. And in fact, I discussed a few of these in a podcast after the election in early November with IBJ finance columnist Peter Dunn. What's interesting is how quickly some of Pete's predictions have come true in just 2 months. At the same time, some of the market-moving elements of the economy have shifted enough in 2 months that Pete is open to a second look. And then there's the event with huge economic implications that few could have predicted, the devastating wildfires that have wiped out parts of Los Angeles and its immediate environs. So Pete is back this week to discuss what we can expect to see in at least the next year or two in a freewheeling conversation hitting rising inflation, stubbornly high costs for consumer goods, the meandering stock market, mass deportations, and what could be the biggest economic story of 2025, the impact of the LA fires on the housing industry. Here's our conversation. It's my pleasure, as always, to welcome back to the podcast, Peter Dunn, a.k.a. Pete the Planner. Thank you for making time this morning, sir.
Oh, I'm excited to be here. 2025. My voice is still recovering from apparently a wild New Year's Eve, all the excitement in our world, but I'm glad to be here with you.
If you still have trouble from New Year's Eve, I think you need to take more vitamins.
That's a good point.
So the last time we spoke was roughly 2 months ago. After former President Donald Trump won a second term, you helped us understand what we could expect potentially from the new administration, at least on an economic basis. And then we agreed, and it turns out my memory of this was wrong. We agreed actually off microphone to revisit this before the inauguration. Sure enough, there is new news that we can cover here. I did just quickly want to make sure we're all on the same page. Is it fair to say that the Trump economic agenda still includes prioritizing tax cuts, decreasing regulation in several major industries, increasing tariffs on imported goods from trading partners like Mexico, Canada, and China, and cracking down on illegal immigration?
It seems as though that's still the case. And the last time we spoke, for what it's worth, I like being right. But since we spoke, so many of these things have started to come to fruition. It's been really good for my ego. One commenter at IBJ.com on our last interview, and yes, occasionally I read the comments, said that my alarmist comments about tariffs were misguided because it was a negotiation technique. So my one thing I will say is, if it simply is a negotiation technique and we're not going to have these high tariffs, then some of the things that we're going to talk about wouldn't make sense. But if I take the president-elect at face value, then those tariffs are going to have an impact.
So here's the first thing, and this is very recent news that probably make you feel good. In our conversation in November, you predicted that at the beginning of the Trump administration, we would see a period of economic growth due in part to low interest rates and decreased regulation, but that inflation would start to creep up by the end of this year. Well, it's already started.
Yeah. And so with that, we're not going to probably see the Fed feels slightly paralyzed right now. They don't know what to do. I think they're going to slow their interest rate cuts. And so this could have some early impact on the Trump administration, the fact that inflation's high. Now, I bring up this next part, Mason, not cynically, but practically. There are people that it's like, okay, great. Now, when are the price of eggs coming down? Great. When are the price of bacon coming down? President-elect Trump campaigned on this idea that prices will come down because inflation's too high. That doesn't work that way. I don't think that's going to be the case.
We're going to hit that in a second. Let me just give folks the numbers real quick. So this is the news from yesterday, January 15th. Consumer price growth has already started ticking up. It rose from 2.7% in November to almost 3% in December. This came as a bit of a surprise to economists. I think everybody would agree that one of the defining issues of the election was inflation and the sense among consumers that their standard of living is now increasingly unaffordable. So yeah, as you say, Trump is inheriting inflation that is already on the rise before instituting tariffs or pursuing other policies that could raise inflation. Are you surprised by this rise of inflation? Is this just a little Biden blip, or does this forebode a bigger problem than we anticipated?
Did you just coin Biden blip? Is that a thing? Is that
I did with 2 days left in his administration. I am here to trademark something having to do with Biden.
Great strategic move by you, Mason. I'm a little surprised, to be honest, that it went up. But again, and not to downplay it, but average inflation from a financial planning standpoint, most financial planners look at 3% long-term inflation. So I view 2.7 to 3%. I view that to be a marginal difference. But if it stays spicy or gets spicier, some of these predictions we made around early market gains and robust activity, they start to break down sooner than we thought.
So I wanted to address what Trump has said about his strategy for bringing down, as you said, like the cost of groceries in particular. Like he agrees this is a tough problem, but he thinks that lowering grocery prices is achievable by resolving supply chain issues and boosting domestic energy production. So the rationale is that, it takes more fuel to ship products to stores. In theory, if the country produces more fuel, the price at the pump will drop. The savings the farmers and shippers realize could then trickle down to consumers. How does that sound?
I didn't know it was going to be how Trump thinks he's going to bring down inflation versus my opinions on that, but I'll be glad to offer them to you. Theoretically, bringing down the cost of transporting goods and would bring down the cost of those goods. I like to think of eggs. Eggs are an easy one. I don't know how many eggs we import. To me, it feels like the eggs are just down the street. I don't know if it's a ridiculous statement, but in my mind, eggs are always just down the street. Maybe that's living in Indiana. Just the eggs are literally just down the street.
Oh, yeah.
Do gas prices impact the price of eggs that much? Is that why omelets are so expensive, because of fuel prices? I don't think so. But I guess we'll see, right? Like, I don't want to be right here. I'd love to be wrong. I'd love for egg prices to come down because we are drilling for more domestic oil.
I know that domestic energy production is really at one of its highest points ever in American history. And perhaps as a result, American gas is at about 3 gallon, I think, right now.
Yeah. And as a side note, on my podcast, we sort of do a little game where we pick our stock picks of the year. I chose a domestic oil company as my pick of the year for that very reason. Like, I think it will be good times for people digging for black gold.
More of a macro perspective, if you will. Last time we talked, you posited consumer prices will never go down. It is always a question of how quickly they will continue to rise. Maybe they won't rise for 6 months instead of 2 months. But once they go up, they don't come back down. Do you still believe that?
I do. I think you're going to see little pockets of like casual dining restaurants get aggressive with their pricing. I think you even saw McDonald's and Applebee's, who are major players in the food game, have more value menu items to keep people dining out. I think that was a real concern in that space. I think coming off the pandemic, a Big Mac meal gets north of $10. That's problematic. I was in New York a couple of weeks ago, and I always like to peek my head in at McDonald's just to see what Manhattan value meal prices are. It's crazy. They're so much higher than they are here.
Wow. Like how high? Can you quote me something?
I think $12, $13.
Oh my God. Hey, I wanted to say something about eggs real quick that I thought was interesting. So was it last week before Snowmageddon? We just went to pick up a few things and we walked by the egg aisle, and I've never seen literally no eggs.
Oh, I thought you were saying you saw Barron Trump in the egg aisle. It was Barron. I thought this was back to the inauguration, but it turned out it just was empty.
I have complicated feelings about Barron. I mean, I'm generally sympathetic, but I just don't know him. But now I'm talking about eggs, and I don't know what that speaks to exactly. Is it perhaps the mindset that we found ourselves in, where we've forgotten what life was like in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and that when it snows, you still can survive.
I don't know what people do south of 96th Street, but I'll just say when it snows and all those eggs are consumed in caramel, people are making souffles. That's all I know.
Let them eat souffles, they say in Carmel. Now, we know the U.S. imports a significant amount of food from Mexico and Canada, so I assume increased tariffs, should those actually materialize, and are not just a negotiating tactic. The tariffs on the goods from those countries would raise the cost of food.
Absolutely. I think that's one of the biggest threats to this whole thing. I think if there are significant tariffs out of Mexico, things like avocados, cilantro, any sort of produce is going to, not that people use it. There's my caramel comments again. I'm concerned about the cost of cilantro. I'm panicking. Yeah, in caramel, that's a very big deal. I can't have cilantro. I think that's a very big deal. I think the cost of products out of Mexico, and not just food, but we talked about this last time, the parts that end up in cars that are then manufactured here becomes a really big issue. That's why on my show, I chose my biggest loser of the year is GM. I think GM is going to suffer from the tariff situation because of the parts made outside of the country to then get assembled here in the United States.
Yeah, that's something, that we hit in the podcast a couple months ago. Let me ask you about the crackdown on illegal immigration. I've seen comments that mass deportation of immigrants who are in the country illegally could affect consumer prices. Does that ring any bells for you?
It does. I can give you an opinion here, a slightly informed opinion. I think you're going to see some labor force issues if that's the case. I think, which could lead to different prices. It could lead to different value and service levels, but there will certainly be an economic impact, a negative economic impact if there's mass deportation.
Looking at a piece from the global economic advisory firm, Oxford Economics, and their analyst for the U.S. economy forecasted a hit to economic growth of maybe like 0.5%, maybe like the high 2s to low 2s, if the Trump administration significantly tightens immigration policy. But, those are consultants.
I'm anxious to see on day one, which is very soon. And by the time people are listening to this, we are on day one. How many of these policies, especially mass deportation, really is prioritized within the system? Is it truly a day one thing? Or are there so many things that the Trump administration said they would do on day one? Does it just naturally get deprioritized? I don't know. With inflation increasing a little bit heading into this and government shutdown looming not too far from now, I think there's a lot of fish to fry. It just doesn't feel like mass deportation is going to be the priority that it was said to be during the campaign.
Let's take a quick break to hear from our sponsor. This is the IBJ Podcast.
Taft, today's modern law firm. With more than 800 attorneys in 8 primary Midwest markets and the District of Columbia, we provide solutions to the business issues facing middle market and emerging companies alike. We do this through a highly collaborative and inclusive team approach. Taft, the modern law firm. To learn more, visit taftlaw.com.
All right, we're back with this week's edition of the IBJ Podcast. In my interview with Pete the Planner about the potential financial impact of a second Trump administration, as well as the devastating wildfires in Los Angeles. You mentioned the stock market. Another development that we've seen in the last couple of months has been a gradual decline in the big stock market gains that we saw in the days and the couple of weeks after Trump was elected. So for those of us who have a lot of our net worth wrapped up in the stock market, I think everyone, regardless of political affiliation, could agree that they appreciate the stock market narrative that Trump is good for business. But depending on which index you look at, those gains after November 5th have either been completely erased or at least blunted. It's difficult to analyze moves in the major indexes as if they're sort of like anthropomorphic, intelligences. But what do you take from how those early gains have fallen?
It's been interesting for sure, because the stock market in the last few years has really done some remarkable things. I'm going to go back to 2018 for a second. I'll get to your question, but let's go 2018. The S&P 500 ended down between 4 and 5% in 2018. 2019, which was an amazing year and everyone felt it, was up more than 31%, which is a remarkable year. Then the year that felt bad but oddly was good, 2020, COVID year, up 18%. And then 21, with all of the stimulus dollars flowing into the economy, you knew the market was going to go up, and it did. It went up 28%. So from 2019, 2020, 2021, it was up 31, up 18, up 28. That's a massive 3-year run. And then you knew with inflation and with the stimulus getting pulled out of the economy in 2022, the market was down 18%. Now the last 2 years are both north of 25%. So that's to say, even with the slowdown, the cool down, what you call the Biden blip at the end of the Biden administration.
You're taking me out of context.
Don't
take my trademark stuff out of context.
Still up 25% in 2024. So this is as hot as the stock market has been in a really long time. All things considered, if inflation catches up with the way I think it will because of tariffs and prices just not coming down late in 2025, I'm going to regret this prediction, but I see a modest year at best in the stock market. I just don't think we can stay this hot as we've stayed last 2 years, both north of 25%.
Okay. Yeah, 2 months ago, you said we're going to see a hot stock market this year. Are you feeling less confident?
I think early we absolutely will. But I think again, because look at 2022 when inflation was everything anyone could talk about, down 18%. If inflation gets out of control again and you start to see an unemployment number creep up, then you're going to see the market sort of level out a little bit. I do think one prediction we made back around election time was that cryptocurrency is going to go bonkers. And I still believe that very much, that as nation states try to have a supply of cryptocurrency, specifically Bitcoin, and given that there's a limited supply of Bitcoin, I think you're going to see prices increase significantly there.
Now, you haven't offered a disclaimer yet that you don't want anybody to make investing advice based on what you say in this video. I'll say it for you.
Yeah, don't make decisions based on what you're hearing. I barely have a voice. I don't think you need to take investment advice from a gravelly voiced person this early in the year.
So I'm going to assume that you don't in any way intend for people to take what you just said and interpret that as a thumbs up for cryptocurrency.
No, but I will say, I mean, in the spirit of full disclosure, my personal stance and views on cryptocurrency have evolved in the last year. I know. For those that can't see things, because this is a audio format, Mason almost fell off of his stool.
What?
I believe the fact that nation state, this is not advice. I believe that since so many nation states are going to be in a rush, and also including cities and states to try within their treasury to put things like Bitcoin in it, it goes back to simple supply and demand. I think that stabilizes the market. You're not going to see as much fluctuation. I think over the next 5 years, you're going to see some pretty massive lifts in valuation of Bitcoin.
I hate that you planted that thought in my head.
I hate it that I planted in my head. And here's the thing. I've said recently, I started reading books about UAPs or UFOs and are they real? It's I don't need another thing to believe in. Trust me. I really don't. So now, right now in my life, am I supposed to believe in UAPs and now cryptocurrency? And it's is this what a midlife crisis is? It's you just choose to believe more?
Let's talk about taxes for a second. We know income taxes will increase for most taxpayers in 2026 unless Congress extends the Tax Cut and Jobs Act from the first Trump administration. My impression that at least extending those cuts is widely held as a priority for Trump in this new administration. According to the U.S. News and World Report, Congress may face pressure to add additional tax cuts that were proposed on the campaign trail, like eliminating taxes on tips, overtime pay, and Social Security benefits, and to change the cap on deducting state and local taxes. The drawback in extending the tax cuts and even deepening them is a loss of revenue to the government and potential for deepening the federal debt. But we saw at the end of last year an indication that Congress and the president are not aligned on the possibility of raising the debt ceiling, which is the upper limit set on the amount of money that a government can borrow. What do you think is going to happen?
I would bet the farm that the tax cuts get extended. And I am choosing my words here. Sometimes I actually choose my words. I know most of the times it sounds like I don't choose my words. This time I am. I don't think the Trump administration cares whatsoever that there'll be a loss of tax revenue with tax cuts. I think whatever the DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, they're just going to account for that theoretically with whatever moves that department makes. I do think not taxing tips and all of that, I think theoretically that could get through. Those changes could take place. I think there'll be a ton of unintended consequences, and they'll be much messier than anyone really cares for it to be. But you can take the extension of the tax cuts to the bank. Think about the things the Trump administration is trying to get Congress to align on right now. Some things that are really hard to align on, from his nominations of his cabinet and all these other things. I think they can align on tax cuts pretty quick. That's sort of a decades old agreement there. It's definitely happening. I feel like I'm tempting fate by saying it's definitely happening, but it's definitely happening.
Yeah, I'm aligned with your line of thinking there. This is interesting. In my life, I've probably heard people argue about the debt ceiling a million times, and I really didn't understand what the debt ceiling was until I looked it up. It's pretty interesting. So my understanding is that the party that is in the minority can use the debt ceiling as a way to limit spending or tax cuts proposed by the majority party, which suddenly is like at a beach party and thinking, hey, we're in charge. We can do all the stuff that we wanted to do. Basically a politicized tool. But there are folks, and I would assume Republicans, who see it as a necessary obstacle just for total freewheeling spending. To raise the debt ceiling is sort of a thing that is hard to change, I would imagine.
I think once that tool is used by one party and how culturally it's now what it's turned into, I don't think you're going to see that change anytime soon. And to some degree, it's kind of all the Democrats have right now. It's like the only tool they have to slow things down because they've got a loss of control. It'll be interesting because you can't have your cake and eat it too. You can't have tax cuts and then keep raising the debt ceiling and expect that it all works out. We did talk about this right after the election. Some organization, which has a beautiful acronym, did a projection on President-elect Trump's policies and the impact on the federal debt. And they're pretty spicy. Trillions of dollars of debt added based on these policies, much more so than the Biden administration, which you call the Biden blip. So I think 4 years from now, again, this isn't meant to be cynical. I just think 4 years from now, while we're going to have much lower taxes, I think the deficit is going to be so much larger than it is now.
Let me do a quick roundup here. So you still think energy production stocks will do well?
Yes.
What about renewable energy companies?
No, I don't whatsoever. I think solar investments and wind investments on a federal level are just going to suffer and suffer and suffer.
Will the banking industry still go bananas, as you said 2 months ago?
I did say 2 months ago, and it started this week, just so you know.
Yeah.
Earnings have been monster earnings from the banks. And so if they're there now, I think you're going to see huge returns for bank stocks.
I'm looking forward to them to reduce the fees now that they finally are doing well.
Yeah. Don't hold your breath, pal.
Also, you kind of made a point of saying we are not going to wrestle with AI to the point of trying to regulate it in any way. Or the Trump administration is just going to let them go and see what happens.
I still feel that way. And I feel that way, especially given all of the tech CEOs' contributions to inauguration fees and the inauguration fund. Like the tech CEOs are really buddying up to the Trump administration right now. And I don't think they want limits on AI. So if they have President Trump's ear, I don't think you're going to see AI regulation at all.
You know, one of the biggest things that has changed since our last conversation has been the fires in Los Angeles and the loss of, well more than 10,000 buildings. They've created just a lot of probably necessary conversations about, home insurance, affordability. What do you think about the impact on the housing market of these fires?
Yeah, what a terrible story. It's just terrible. We have close family that the fire was within 5 blocks of their house and their school burnt down. It's just terrible stuff. And I think it's going to be a massive impact. And Mason, I think this is going to be a story for 3 or 4 years easy. Even if you go with something like building supplies, the demand for building supplies, whether it be wood or other materials, I saw even roofing materials are going to be so in demand as these homes go back up. I think you're going to see the housing market in greater LA suffer from a rental standpoint as people need a temporary place to live. I think this impacts the World Cup. I think this potentially impacts the Olympics. I think it impacts a lot. And so I think the economic story of 2025 and arguably 2026 will be the rebuild of LA. I think it will have as big of impact on anything, and it will reset the housing market for sure. And the insurers, I think that's going to be coming off hurricane season, coming off of now wildfire season. I think the insurers are in real big trouble. And the only way that people get the insurance coverage they feel like they need is going to come through state or federal regulation, which is then going to put the insurance companies in an even worse spot. The second regulation gets involved with insurance, then insurance companies are even in more trouble. So yeah, biggest story by far of 2025 will be the rebuild of LA.
Long-term trend that I'm interested in is as they begin to rebuild giant swaths of LA, how much they are going to, or what the tension is going to be between adding further regulation to construction, regulating particular materials that are fireproof, or particular designs that are found to be fireproof, and the housing industry's desire just to get stuff built.
Right. So like flame retardant materials and those sorts of things. This juxtaposes with another topic we've discussed today, which is the labor force, Southern California labor force. You need people to build these homes. Again, I try not, when I make predictions, we do them for fun. We do them to make other people think and think it through. So I try not to give dystopian predictions. You kind of see California being put on this island. And some would argue they put themselves on this island. I choose not to really go there. But if mass deportation takes place, and there is a lot of regulation around materials coming out of the state of California, you're just getting this ugly combination of elements that how can you rebuild LA without the labor, with all this regulation that the state itself will probably put in place? And then you've got the water issues that I'll let other people to debate. Turns out I'm barely a constitutional law expert on Twitter. I can't be a forestry and fire and water expert too.
It's kind of a dour note, but that's actually sounds like a pretty good place to stop. Everything going okay with you?
Yeah. I mean, I hope to lose this middle school voice pretty soon and get back to an adult voice, but we'll see what happens.
Okay. Right at the end of the year, we finally got our new roof. So I'm kind of happy about the timing of that.
I'm not kidding. If you think about if interest rates do come down again and the housing market outside of LA starts to boom, you're talking about construction materials for new homes. I was going to say are going to go through the roof, but I was really meaning roofing materials, and so that got weird. But that is a story to follow. It could stifle economic progress.
Okay, well, let's wrap it up here. But for my industry and your industry, there's going to be plenty to talk about in the next 2 months.
Absolutely. I'll be here.
All right, pal. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Mason.
Boy, that was less fun than I thought.
Oh, geez, really?
I just feel so bad. Oh my!
I think
God.
the California thing is going to be I was going to say it's going to be a disaster. It already is a disaster, but I think there's a lot of elements on both sides coming in to that. The labor issue is going to be, you can't mass deport tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people when it needs a labor market, you know?
Yeah, and create an environment where even people who are here legally are kind of reticent to kind of get outside their neighborhood. Okay. What's the stock market doing? Can I feel good about that?
Yeah. I don't know what it's doing today. It's flat.
My thanks again to Peter Dunn. A quick reminder, his column on personal finance appears regularly in the print edition of IBJ, and you can find several years' worth of his work at IBJ.com. And folks, before you get on with the rest of your week, there are a few stories in this week's edition of IBJ I want to draw to your attention. First up, from the outside looking in, Indianapolis Mayor Joe Hogsett's pursuit of a Major League Soccer club seems to have come to a standstill. although several parcels in and near the area earmarked for the stadium have changed hands. Mickey Shuey brings us up to date on recent developments and the long list of hurdles that remain. Also in this week's issue, Greg Weaver explores why Indiana law firms prioritize lobbying as a necessary service for clients. And Daniel Lee has our annual compendium of Indiana-based philanthropic giving, topped by a $150 million gift to a university, and listing more than 50 other donations around the state of $1 million or more. And again, you can find these stories in the latest print edition of IBJ or online at IBJ.com. I will say it is quite a bit easier to access all of the latest local business news and all of IBJ's data on Central Indiana's business, community, and economy if you're a subscriber. We're running a promotion right now that gives you complete access for $1 per week for 3 months just to get a sense of how valuable and original our content is. Just go to IBJ.com and click on the subscribe button. And thanks again for making time this week for the IBJ Podcast. I'm Mason King. Hang in there, everybody. We'll be back again next week.